Alrighty, I got one sewed down, and according to laying it out like this, it's going to be about 4 to 5 inches. But we want to make sure all of our needles are going one way. Alright, so now let's just get ready and let's go in there and let's do the next row. Alrighty, the first thing I want to do is I got white. I'm going to put one white back here. Okay, now the next one I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to look at it and I'm going to say this one's okay and this one a little bit. I can see right here I need to go down a little bit more because it's not right. And then trim it down. So I want to make sure that all of them are sewed all the way around, and if they need to be trimmed, trim them up. And all you gotta do is just drip, drip, drip. Alright, a little bit don't matter. That looks fine. We can't put white and white together. We want to put blue. So let's see what we got here. This looks good. So we can put a white and a white. Make sure our pins are going fine. Alright. Alright, now, let's see how this one right here needs to be trimmed down. So we will trim it down. That shows that it looks a whole lot better if you trim it down. Alright. Want to lay these out. And then we're going to sew them down.
Hi guys, welcome to Cryptids Canada. I hope you're all having an amazing day. I apologize for missing so many days. I've had this nasty flu, almost impossible to kick, but I am starting to feel a little bit better, so I thought I'd better take advantage of it. So I just wanted to tell you guys that about little over a year ago, I was invited to be interviewed for an up-and-coming book. So I said sure, and I kind of forgot all about it. Then, lo and behold, I was contacted by the author, whose name is Brad Grogan.
Alrighty, the last one, I'm going to sew on to the one that needs, that puts it right. Let's see. Yeah, so we can kind of do it just a little bit. Alright, you don't want to forget to go ahead and do this one too if it needs to be trimmed. Alright. Alright, let's make sure we got everything right. And we're going to sew her down.
And he said the book, which is called The Big Book of Bigfoot, is indeed published. So out of the kindness of his heart, he sent me a copy, and I can't even begin to tell you guys, I am so humbled, first and foremost, that I am in a group with some of the biggest names in Bigfoot research. Completely blown me away. I don't deserve to be there, that's for sure. But aside from all of that, the book features the Bostwick Massacre story, which I found to be quite interesting. I'd never heard that before. And then there's quite a few other encounter stories. And then it goes into media, which includes details about the first 100 movies, and then a list of 100 books. And I actually found my book in that list. Can you believe that? And then it goes on to documentaries and TV shows, and then on to YouTube channels and podcasts. And I just discovered myself in that list as well. Holy smokes. Oh, I see Nance from Buckeye Bigfoot and Cam from Dixie Cryptids. Well, you guys, honestly, I think you will thoroughly enjoy this book. It's The Big Book of Bigfoot. I'll put the links in the description box of where you can get this on Amazon. And I hope you do. I know you'll enjoy it. Alrighty then, enough of the jibber jabber. Let's get right to the story. Okay, my name is Leanne Kenner and my husband is Frank, and we are both boating enthusiasts. We live on Vancouver Island, and one of our favorite things to do is to travel up the Strait, or the Strait of Georgia, which is a body of water between Vancouver Island and the mainland of British Columbia. I guess you could say old habits die hard, because we enjoy this area and spent most of every weekend on our boat, stopping in to see friends, and sometimes just a few of us would caravan up and down the coast. Everybody from the area will tell you that this strip of ocean is unbeaten for the amount of wildlife that can be watched on a daily basis. When we first started, we only had a small boat, and I think the longest we ever went out was about 4 days, and then it was time to go home. We started to take a look at things and decided that we would much rather go without some of the creature comforts at home and then buy a bigger boat. So that's what we did. We upgraded to a 32-footer, which absolutely made our trips away much more comfortable. So in July of 2002, we decided to take a month-long holiday and see the whole west side of Vancouver Island. We were having the time of our lives, and we were way ahead of schedule. So friends of ours had mentioned a place called Namu that was a ghost town, and it was just a little bit further up the coast and well worth investigating. Frank and I were more than a little ready to spend a few days on land and explore. Not so much the old buildings and houses, but the glorious lush wilderness that hadn't been explored in at least 30 years, I would bet. So we dropped our anchor and started preparing our packs to spend a few days in the woods. Frank was friends with a gentleman who was making different prototypes of camping tents for a new company. And Frank asked them if they had this type of hammock tent that is very popular in this day and age, but back then it was new. And sure enough, he had a couple. For those of you who don't know what a hammock tent is, well, imagine a hammock, but the sides coming up and almost around you. It is a lot like a cocoon and very, very comfortable. And for those days and nights that you're going to get heavy winds and rain, there's a tarp that can go over it as well. And we opted to use those tarps because in the woods of British Columbia, it can rain in a moment's notice. So as I mentioned, as we were preparing our packs, I kept looking towards the area that we would soon be exploring. I started getting the creeps really bad. I felt like we were being watched, and I started to tell Frank that I'm not liking this area at all. So we talked, And Frank, being the easiest going person to get along with, said, "No problem, sugar. Let's just move up a little ways and go around the cove and see what's up ahead." So sure enough, that's what we did. And we came across a beautiful beach. So once again, we lowered our anchor, loaded everything in our dinghy, and made our way to the shore. Honestly, we could have stayed right there on the beach, but both of us wanted to explore. So after hiking through the woods for about 2 hours, we were getting pretty tired. And then we came across another beach, but this one was beside a decent-sized freshwater stream, which was perfect, because now we didn't have to be careful with the water we brought. That night, we literally sat in that stream butt naked. We hadn't really showered because our fresh water maker on the boat was broken, and nobody wants to shower in salt water. So we were thoroughly enjoying ourselves, and once again I got that feeling that we were being watched. But this time it didn't feel as foreboding as it had the first time. I said to Frank, "How about we go back to camp and start making dinner?" And he agreed. So we stayed up for a while, and keep in mind we were fairly young, still in our 30s, and spending all that time naked in front of each other, well, you know what I mean. But because we had 2 separate hammocks, and even though they were fairly close together, they weren't close enough, if you know what I mean. So we got a blanket and we put it on the ground beside the fire, and we got romantic. Well, all of a sudden I feel Frank squeeze my arms and whisper, "Don't move." I asked, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "There's something watching us." And I asked, "What do you mean?" And he says, "I don't know, but there's something about 20 feet from our heads in the woods, and I think it's big." And I said, "Frank, you're scaring me. What do you mean?" And he said, I don't know." Well, to be honest, that killed the moment. So we both nonchalantly sat up and pretended that we didn't notice that this thing was still watching us. I reached up and scratched my head and casually looked in that direction, and I seen these black, shiny eyes staring back at us from the woods. I looked away and I squeezed Frank's hand. I said, "What are we going to do?" He said, "Just breathe easy and chit-chat like we don't know anything is there." And sure enough, after a few minutes, it lost interest and just walked away. Or at least we thought it had. We sat at the fire and had a few shots of cognac and called it a night. Just before going to bed, Frank said, "Oh crap, I need to get this food away from camp and up high." Stupidly, inexperienced mixed with a few drinks made us lazy. And I said, "I wouldn't worry about it. Just put it by the fire and that should keep animals away." Again, LOL, ignorance. So we crawled into our separate hammocks, and I'll tell you, I was asleep in seconds. And I had never been more comfortable in my whole life while camping. I woke up the next morning to the birds chirping, and I felt absolutely wonderful. As soon as I opened my eyes, I smelled coffee, and I whispered, "Frank, are you up?" And he said, "I sure am. Come on, get up, I'll make you breakfast." And we had a nice leisurely morning, enjoying the breakfast that Frank made. We decided we were going to stay there another night because it was such a perfect location. But we were going to spend our day hiking and seeing what we could find in this really cool spot. As we were hiking, maybe an hour into it, we started hearing something banging on trees, and it was way too loud to be a woodpecker. But the one thing that really kind of made us nervous is that it seemed to be getting closer. We would hear it quite a distance away, to the west of us, and then something to the east would reply. Then, 5 minutes later, it was to the northwest. The banging was really loud, and then something to the northeast would bang really loud. I told Frank that I was getting really nervous, and he said, yeah, I haven't been able to figure out what the heck could be banging on those trees. And then he added that it felt like something was communicating. I told him that that's exactly what I had been thinking myself. So we decided to just head back to camp and spend another nice day at the stream. Neither one of us was carrying a weapon. All we really had was bear spray. So far, we hadn't even seen any sign of bears. Yet we had seen sign of deer and found a couple of antlers. No sooner had Frank and I said that, when all of a sudden we got a whiff of something so putrid. And then Frank said, "That has to be a bear." I said that I knew that bears smelled, but I didn't think that they smelled that bad. And he said, "Oh yeah, sometimes they can." The smell was so bad that I had to switch between breathing through my nose and then breathing through my mouth. I couldn't figure out which was worse, smelling it or tasting it. But I knew we had to get back fast because this was awful. I covered my mouth and I gagged for probably 3 to 5 minutes. Finally, the smell seemed to go away. So we finally got back to camp and both of us decided to lay down and have a quick nap. But it was like 6:30 by the time we woke up. We were just knocked right out. By now I was starving and we hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. And this time we had left our food tied up way up in a tree about 25 feet down the stream from us. Finally, Frank came back with the bags and we decided on what we were going to have for dinner. A quick and easy meal of hot dogs on the fire. Neither one of us wanted to fiddle with making a large meal. After we stuffed ourselves with hot dogs, we put the coffee on the fire, and now it was getting dark. All of a sudden, that smell was back. I said, "I can't stand that smell. It's going to make me sick." And he said, "Where the heck is it coming from?" Frank walked over to the backpack and grabbed the big flashlight out, and he started shining it all throughout the woods around us. And that's when we saw what we now know was to be a Sasquatch, and it was standing there quite a ways back in the woods. It wasn't hiding behind a tree. It was just standing there staring at us. And then it realized that we could see it. It turned around and stomped further into the woods. And the smell took about 15 minutes to disappear as well. Both of us were stunned into silence. I was shaking so bad I could barely find my voice. I said, "Let's just leave everything and go." Both of us stood up and went and got our backpacks, and we left everything else. He used his right hand to hold the flashlight, and then reached behind him with his left hand, holding on to me to make sure I was right behind him. He kept squeezing my hand and saying softly, "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay." We were walking twice the speed that we had been the day before coming into the woods. And then all of a sudden Frank stopped and said, "I think we're lost." I honestly felt like I was going to panic, and I said, "Are you serious?" And he said, "Yeah, I think we're lost." He said, "Listen, I think it's in our best interest to go back to the camp and just stay there for the night. I think it'll be okay because that thing hadn't tried to hurt us, right?" And as much as I wanted to tell him no, I realized that it was the only choice we had. Frank added, "Listen, I think it might have smelt the coffee, and that might have lured it in." I had to admit, Frank was right. I didn't want to be lost in the wilderness with bears and mountain lions and now Sasquatch. I started to cry and shake, and he told me it's going to be okay. So then we made our way back to camp. Everything looked exactly the way we had left it. So that helped some of the fear dissipate. And at that moment, we built up the fire pretty high, and then both of us climbed in our hammocks and eventually fell asleep. I don't know how long I'd been asleep for, but I started hearing something rubbing the nylon top of my hammock. My eyes flew open the second I heard it, and I sat there holding my breath. I could hear that Frank was sleeping, and he was breathing heavily. Then I heard the Sasquatch pick up the backpack, and then walked towards the woods. I kept hoping, go, keep going, but it didn't. I heard sounds of clothing and paper rustling, and then I heard what sounded like something picking up Frank's pack. And then a second later, I worked up the courage, and I lifted up my flap that covered me, and I saw his butt and back as clear as day. He was crouched over our packs on the other side of the fire. All of a sudden, Frank let out a loud huff, puff, and a loud snore. And right at the same moment, I heard the Sasquatch take off running out of camp. I lay there terrified for several hours at least. I was even afraid to gently call out to Frank. Finally, I must have dozed off, and when I woke up, the birds were chirping and Frank was waking up. I said, Frank, we have to leave now. It was back here a few hours ago. So then we got up, and that's when we discovered all of our stuff gone, except for the hammocks. Once again, we left the hammocks and we started going as fast as we could through the woods. We noticed exactly where we made the mistake the night before and turned slightly to the left instead of going right. But we didn't make that mistake again. After walking for about 45 minutes, I just happened to look slightly to the left and in front of me, and I saw a big jumbled mess. I pointed it out to Frank, and he said, that looks like our backpacks. So he made his way over there, and sure enough, it was. I was begging Frank to forget it and let's just leave. Frank said, I think all the food's pretty much gone, but everything else seems to be here. He packed everything up quick, and we started on our way again. 20 minutes later, we could see the beach, and sure enough, our skiff was still tied there. I think both of us pretty much held our breath till we got to our boat, got everything on board, and we left. We weren't taking our time getting home that day. We weren't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. We just wanted to desperately be in our own home. After we came to our senses, we decided not to let that stop us from enjoying our life. And that's what we did. We never did have another experience, but there really wasn't anything so terribly wrong with the first experience. Of course, it was scary seeing something that we weren't even sure existed. Now, however, we know for sure they do. I think that if I was to ever see another one, I think I would be curious about it. I don't think I would fear it as much. And when I really think about it, I think that it was just curious about us. That was in 2002, and it's signed Leanne, and then Frank's name is in brackets. That was a really, really good story.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Doge Watch, where if you give us just a few minutes of your time, we will give you the latest and greatest of everything Doge has been working on for the past week. I am your host, Nick Freitas. Let's get into it. Now, there are a lot of things to first get furious about and then be relieved that Doge is actually uncovering this wasteful spending, and we're going to give you some more examples from this past week. For instance, NASA is eliminating $45 million in spending that was going to 3 different contractors to provide something called change management support services. The DoD is eliminating a contract that is $280 million. No, that's not the best way to put it. It was 780% over budget and 5 years behind. The Department of Labor was spending $38 million to increase transparency in the cotton industry in Uzbekistan. Or how about the Department of the Interior, which contracted $75 million with the Federal Contracting Group for the purpose of developing internal customer satisfaction surveys. And then the same department turned around and was attempting to award a contract to, guess what? Conduct customer satisfaction surveys. By the way, here's an example of the quality $75 million gets you when it's a government contract. The bottom line is it is both frustrating that these contracts ever existed and excellent that they're being finally exposed by Doge. Having said that, there is one contract in particular identified by Doge this week that is truly torch and pitchfork worthy. An IT modernization program within the federal government that has so far cost $15 billion. that's with a B, and is, wait for it, 30 years overdue. Now, you'd think the media would be covering a scandal of this magnitude, but many of them are ignoring not only this, but a lot of the things that Doge is doing. Now, this modernization plan was supposed to vastly improve transparency, accountability, and customer service. So, I guess it's not hard to see why it's proven so difficult for the feds to make it work, since customer service and transparency are not really their forte. But even taking that into account, what federal agency would be so wasteful, so monumentally cavalier with the taxpayers' dollars as to create a scandal of this magnitude? Well, it's none other than the Internal Revenue Service. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. The very same IRS that will leave no stone unturned harassing all of you tax cheats who are simply trying to desperately comply with a federal tax code that features around 9,000 pages and roughly 4 million words, or, for you Potter fans, that's 4 times the size of the Harry Potter series. Now, keep in mind that this is the same vaunted institution that Senator Elizabeth Warren justified giving an additional $80 billion over the next 10 years in order to track down tax cheats. In fact, she was very excited when the IRS spent close to $800 million in order to recover $500 million in tax revenue. Because remember, boys and girls, it's not about helping the poor or even paying your taxes. It's about punishing people who make more than Elizabeth Warren when she steals jobs intended for Native Americans. In fact, Senator Taxes with a Fist is furious that Doge might have access to taxpayer data that is supposed to be exclusively available for IRS agents, so they can engage in the important work of poring over all of your Venmo transactions over $600. By the way, it used to be $20,000. She was one of the people that voted to bring it all the way down to $600. But what she is not worried about, what she has absolutely zero problem with, is that the same organization has wasted $15 billion of your money on a modernization contract that is 30 years overdue. Let's put this in terms that even our favorite pretendian, Senator Elizabeth Warren, can understand. Even if she's right, even if these estimates that the IRS has actually recaptured $500 million, they've spent $800 million in order to do it. But you know what? Let's be generous. Let's say that the IRS is actually breaking even and it's dollar for dollar. They're spending $500 million to recapture $500 million. That means that at this rate, it would take infinity to just recover the tax dollars that the IRS has wasted on its IT modernization. But no. Let's be super generous. Let's say that the additional $800 million she voted to give the IRS actually brought in double the tax revenue that it cost to go recover it. That would mean that it would take almost 19 years, that's right, 2 decades, just to recover what was wasted by the IRS. And here's the worst part. The unpaid taxes collected by the IRS were actually being used in the economy. So it's not as if the IRS just found unclaimed money sitting in a treasure chest somewhere. That money will now have to be taken out of the productive sector of the economy so the government can now spend it, on things like multi-billion-dollar IT projects that never get completed. But as bad as this boondoggle is, it actually gets worse, because it turns out that the IRS facilitates about as many transactions as a mid-sized bank. The average operations and maintenance budget for a mid-sized bank is around $20 million a year. Anybody want to take a guess at what the O&M budget is for the IRS? $3.5 billion. That means that the IRS is roughly 175 times less efficient than a private sector bank handling a similar level of transactions. Now, that's not 175% less efficient. That's 17,500% less efficient. But wait, there's more. On top of the IRS O&M budget, they have another budget just for modernization, which comes in at an additional $3.7 billion. So if you include that, it would suggest that the IRS is actually closer to about 36,000% less efficient than a bank of similar size. And yet, Elizabeth Warren has the audacity to suggest that the real threat here is Doge and what they're uncovering. Now, you might be wondering, how is it even possible that an organization can be this inefficient? And it can be largely explained by one chart. This chart, which was popularized by Milton Friedman, illustrates a very important point when thinking about how money is spent. So if you'll notice in quadrant 1, it's you spending your money on yourself or someone you love, like a family member. Quadrant 2 is when you spend your money on someone else. Quadrant 3 is when you spend somebody else's money on you. And quadrant 4 is when you spend somebody else's money on somebody else. Now, the most efficient way to spend money naturally usually falls within quadrant 1, because in that quadrant, you're concerned about both quality and price. But in quadrant 4, you aren't concerned about either thing. It's not your money, and you're not going to use the thing that you're actually paying for. And the bottom line is, politicians will always spend money in quadrant 4. And this is true no matter what Congress does. It's true no matter what Doge does. This will always be the reality. And while you can certainly put in rules, practices, and oversight to make it better, and while we can always try and elect politicians that are more frugal, they will still always spend in quadrant 4. So, where does that leave us with these spending bills that we're seeing through all of these departments or organizations like the IRS that seem to be wasting it at monumental pace? Well, the acronym DOGE stands for Department of Government Efficiency. But interestingly enough, that shouldn't mean that every department gets more efficient. If we are truly serious about government as a whole becoming more efficient, we need to start seriously considering which of these departments should even exist at all.